knock came just before midnight. "The Holy Father has asked for you," the Monsignor said, his voice trembling. "He's very sick, and he's asking for you by name." No cardinals, no cameras, just one dying request, whispered into the silence between a pope and the one guard, deliberate, unmistakable. When he opened the door, Monsignor Ventresca stood in the half-light, the Pope's long-time personal secretary. His face, usually composed behind a mask of Vatican discretion, bore something Elias had rarely seen there, genuine sorrow. "The Holy Father has asked for you," Ventresca said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias felt his chest tighten. No questions formed on his lips. In the Guard, you learned to obey first and wonder later. But deep within, he already knew. The whispers had been circulating through the sacred halls for days. Pope Francis was failing. His public appearances had ceased. The quiet preparations had begun. But to be called personally, by name at this hour, this wasn't a duty shift. It was a first private conversations. He carried it always, unseen, but ever present. Ventresca waited silently as Elias adjusted his bearskin helmet under his arm. Once ready, he simply nodded, and the two men moved together through the dim corridors of the barracks. The night air held an unusual stillness as they crossed the courtyard. St. Peter's Square stood empty, the massive colonnade embracing nothing but shadow and stone. No tourists, no cameras, just the weight of centuries watching their passage. They entered the Apostolic Palace through a side entrance rarely used, doors normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. Tonight, no ceremony announced their arrival. Just the hushed echo of their footsteps against marble floors, worn smooth by history. As they climbed a narrow stairwell, Elias's mind drifted back through the years, to the quiet smiles Francis reserved for him after Mass, to the conversations where, improbably, a pontiff had chosen a young Swiss guard as confidant rather than merely protector, not seeking absolution, but connection. Their bond had begun 7 years earlier, when Elias was still new to Rome and to service. Of the avalanche that had claimed not just his family, but half his village. Grief had carved him hollow, then rebuilt him with duty as his foundation. When he'd come to the Vatican, he sought not glory, but purpose. A place where silence was permitted, expected even. Francis had seen past the stoic uniform to the wounded soul beneath. Over the years they had met often, never officially scheduled, never recorded in Vatican logs. Sometimes in chapels after hours, sometimes in gardens when Francis claimed to have gotten lost during his evening walks, always with a quiet understanding between them. There were no grand confessions, no political discussions, just two men, one bearing the weight of the church, the other the weight of memory, finding in each other a reflection of wounds the world rarely allowed them to acknowledge. "Titles weigh heavy, Elias," Francis had once told him, "but pain weighs heavier still. Better to have a few true souls near than 1,000 who only see your robes." As they reached the upper corridor of the Apostolic Palace, Elias noticed the unusual emptiness. The doctors wanted him to rest, but a small sad smile touched the Monsignor's lips. "He can still be quite stubborn." Elias nodded, understanding completely. In their many conversations over the years, Francis had often joked about what he called his Argentine stubbornness, a quality that had both frustrated his advisors and endeared him to millions. Ventresca placed a hand lightly on Elias's shoulder. "He's waiting for you," he said quietly, then pushed the door open. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the soft amber glow of a single lamp. Shadows gathered in the corners like silent witnesses, but the center of the room seemed weightless, as if the very air had thinned out of reverence for its occupant. Pope Francis lay reclined against a modest stack of pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. His white cassock, once filled with the vigour of a man who traversed continents, hung loosely against his diminished frame. Yet when his gaze found Elias, his eyes held the same clear light they always had. With the faintest gesture of his fingers, he beckoned the guard forward. Elias approached with measured steps. Yes, but more truthfully, two men meeting at the threshold between worlds. Francis shifted slightly, the movement requiring visible effort. He lifted one frail hand and pointed to a simple wooden chair positioned near the window, a silent invitation. Without hesitation, Elias moved to the chair and lowered himself onto it, removing his bearskin cap and resting it carefully on his knee. The crucifix on the opposite wall caught a fragment of lamplight, casting a thin shadow across the floor between them. Neither spoke for a long moment. Outside, the basilica bells tolled faintly. Midnight had passed. A new day had begun, though for one of them, days were growing precious and few. "You came," Francis finally whispered, his voice rough but warm. "Always," Elias replied, the word carrying the weight of a vow. The Pope smiled faintly. "They told me you were off duty tonight. I was never off duty for you, Holy Father." Francis's eyelids fluttered closed momentarily, as if gathering strength not for his next breath, but for his next thought. "I was thinking," he said, "how strange it is that in the end it's not the cardinals or the dignitaries I wish to see, not the scholars or the politicians." He opened his eyes again, fixing them on Elias with surprising clarity. "It's you." Elias bowed his head slightly, unsure if he should speak. He waited. "You were never just a guard," Francis murmured. "You were my witness." The words hung between them, heavier than any papal decrees. "You listened when others preached. You saw when others turned away," Francis continued, each breath laboured but deliberate. "You never demanded, never judged. You simply stood." Elias felt the sting of tears, but held mistaken for indifference. His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "In that hour, Elias, you must remember." The words came slower now, each one carefully shaped with the last of his strength. "Remember that love without noise is still love." A final fragile breath. "And that service without audience is still service." Elias bowed his head, unable to hold back the tears that slid silently down his cheeks. But he made no sound. His shoulders did not shake. His posture did not bend. He wept as a guard weeps, silent, reverent. Francis closed his eyes one last time, and they did not reopen. His hand slipped gently from Elias's sleeve to rest against the linen bedsheet. Outside, a distant bell tolled once. Not the solemn announcement of papal passing, but the quiet marking of an hour, unaware that time had shifted irrevocably inside these walls. Elias remained kneeling by the bedside, the Pope's final charge echoing in his mind like a sacred vow, to the man who had once stooped to touch the soul beneath a soldier's armour. Monsignor Ventresca returned quietly, his steps so measured they seemed to blend with the silence rather than break it. He paused a respectful distance away, hands clasped before him, head slightly bowed. No words passed between them. None were needed. Two Vatican aides appeared soon after, their faces solemn in the dim light. They hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to proceed or leave this sacred vigil undisturbed. Ventresca gave a small nod, permitting their entry. They approached with the reverence of men who understood they were witnessing not merely a death, but the closing of an era. Gently they began the ancient rites, prayers murmured softly, the sign of the cross traced over Francis's forehead. Still, Elias remained motionless. Not from obligation, not. He retrieved his bearskin cap from the chair and tucked it under his arm. At the threshold he paused. He turned once, offering a final salute. Not the sharp, parade ground gesture demanded by protocol, but a slow, respectful movement. A farewell between two men whose connection had transcended title and rank. Then he stepped back into the corridor, leaving behind not just a room, but a chapter of his life now sealed forever in his heart. The marble beneath his boots felt colder, each step heavier with the knowledge of what he now carried. Not a secret, a sacred trust. When no one else remembers, you must. Outside, the first pale light of dawn touched the Vatican gardens. A new day was beginning. But for Elias Koenig, it was a different kind of dawn. One marked not by the rising sun, but by the quiet inheritance of a final plea. He did not look back. Some moments, he knew, were meant to be left behind, carried forward only in spirit. The palace, the first subtle signs of awareness were beginning. Staff moved with hushed urgency. Prelates gathered in small clusters, their voices low. Soon bells would toll, announcements would be crafted, ceremonies planned. The machinery of papal transition would awaken with all its somber pageantry. But none of that was Elias's concern now. He was no longer just a guard on duty. He was the keeper of something precious, a memory, a message, a final whisper passed from a dying soul to a living one. He crossed through the side courtyard, where his fellow guards changed posts silently, halberds gleaming in the growing light. No one stopped him, no one questioned his presence. In the unspoken language of soldiers and servants, some things required no explanation. In his small room in the barracks, Elias began the ritual of removing his uniform. First, the